So Kayleigh's Law gives victims of crime, most notably sex crimes, the option to petition the court for an injunction that is valid for their entire life.
Welcome to Shooting Straight with Brad and David. I'm Brad Carline, your Navajo County Attorney.
And I'm David Klaus, your Navajo County Sheriff.
And our special guest this month is Kayleigh Kozak. Kayleigh, thank you very much for joining us. You have such a, I'm going to say a sad story, but a very exciting end to your story with what you're doing now. Can you share with us and our audience what happened to you when you were a young girl?
Of course. Well, I'm just getting started. This is just one chapter in my book. There are many to come, so it's ongoing. But I am a survivor of childhood sexual abuse, and through that, I've definitely been through some things. And because of that, I have been able to also do some things to create effective change for victims and survivors.
We just heard your story at the Victim Rights Symposium, and you were molested by your club soccer coach, who was also a teacher at your middle school you were attending. People always wonder why victims don't say anything when it happens. Can you help explain why a victim doesn't?
Yeah, I mean, for me, in my situation, I didn't realize it until after, but I didn't feel safe enough to say anything. I didn't feel like anybody would believe that he did the things that he did. And so once I got out of that bubble of the town that I lived in and was in a new town where no one knew him, it felt safer to disclose what had happened to me, and like there would be a better chance that they would believe the things that I had to say.
Looking back on it or giving advice to somebody else who unfortunately will be in your shoes someday, what advice would you give them?
Oh, that's tough because no situation is the same, but I would encourage them to find somebody that they trust and tell them. And it can be a parent, a family member, someone within the school. There's so many different avenues that you can take to disclose to someone, but I would really find someone that you trust and talk to them.
And how did it come about that you eventually disclosed what was happening to you?
So I was a freshman in high school, and like I mentioned, I got out of that bubble I was in where he was also in, and we were watching a video called Good Touch, Bad Touch, and everything they described in that video had happened to me. And I didn't want to believe that that was what happened to me, and I kept making excuses, but that was exactly what was happening to me. And although the video didn't say the words grooming, it wasn't really a phrase back in 2006, that's essentially what it was about, was what grooming looks like and how perpetrators target and groom their victims and they prey on them. And everything they were saying in that video was applicable to what I had gone through.
And how did it impact you watching that and coming to that realization?
It was something I can't even explain, because I was sitting there knowing everything that they were saying had happened to me, but not believing that what had happened to me was the same as what they were saying. And I didn't want to believe that he would do the things and that he was the kind of person that they were talking about in that video, but he was.
Why didn't you believe at that time that he was that type of person, knowing what he was doing to you physically and probably emotionally?
Because that's what groomers do. They target their victim, they manipulate them, they create spaces where their victim feels safe, and then they act. And so he made me feel like he actually told me that what he was doing was wrong, but it was different because he cared about me and he would never hurt me.
So he played on your emotions too.
Yes.
One of the dichotomies that you mentioned during your presentation at the symposium was this different mindset that you have as a victim and a survivor.
Yeah.
What are the differences?
Well, I think when you're stuck in that victim mentality, you almost have empathy for your perpetrator, because you don't want to believe that someone who cared about you or claimed that they did could do such bad things. And so you find yourself defaulting to making excuses for them and wanting to believe and see the best in them. And when you can get out of being trapped under the way that they wanted you to see them and actually see them for who you are or for who they are, I think that's where a victim can really go from the victim mentality to the survivor mentality.
How long did it take you to change from that victim mentality to the survivor mentality? And was there any special trigger that helped you make that change?
Yeah, so I turned my abuser in 2006. And when I went to court in 2020, I was still in that victim mentality. And it took me going to therapy to really start working through some of the things that had actually happened to me to realize how bad it was. And I was able to then switch from the victim mentality to the survivor mentality.
You said you went to court like 13 years later,
Yeah.
but the conviction actually happened much sooner than that.
Yes.
Why were you back in court this 13 years later?
So yeah, he was convicted in 2007, but in 2020 I received a phone call informing me that he had has petitioned for his lifetime probation to be terminated. And it's a thing, and sex offenders can petition to have the terms of their probation modified or even completely lifted, and that was in fact what he was petitioning for.
And you had invoked your victim rights for post-conviction notification.
Yes.
So did you go and speak then at that hearing where he was trying to get removed from lifetime probation?
I did. I did go testify and speak for myself during his hearing to have his probation lifted.
What was some of the motivations you had to do that? Because it had to be emotionally challenging to bring back the trauma of what happened and other challenges.
It was, and I had 3 weeks to make a decision on whether or not I was going to go testify or just not do anything. And I actually didn't decide until the night of that I was going to go to court. But ultimately, what made me go was that if I didn't go and he got off probation, I would never forgive myself for not trying. But at least if I went and I tried and my voice was heard, I could say that I tried.
And on probation, he can't have contact with you. If the probation was lifted, would that have changed?
Prior to Kayleigh's law, yes. If he would have gotten off probation, then there would have been nothing by law keeping him from contacting me if he wanted to.
All right, you just mentioned Kayleigh's law. Your name is Kayleigh. Do you have something to do with what people are referring to as Kayleigh's law?
I do. I am the namesake behind Kayleigh's law.
So explain to us what it is and how it came about.
So Kayleigh's law gives victims of crime, most notably sex crimes, the option to petition the court for an injunction that is valid for their entire life.
So whose entire life? The defendant or yours?
Or the victims.
Okay.
There's clause in there that, if one dies, then the injunction is no longer valid, but for the duration of a natural lifetime. And it was so important that we included natural in this because there is no definition for lifetime. And so by putting that in there, we're ensuring that it is actually in effect for a lifetime. And prior to this law, a victim's only direct protection fell within the terms of the perpetrator's probation status. So if that probation was lifted, a victim would no longer have direct protection from the person who has already harmed them.
And why did you kind of explain, but go into more detail why you thought that was so important to get a lifetime injunction?
Well, it is so important. Victims endure so much, and at the very least, they deserve protection from the person who has harmed them and taken so much from them. But in my case specifically, my parents agreed to a plea deal where my perpetrator had 2 terms of lifetime probation in lieu of extended prison time. So they were under the assumption that he would be on probation for his entire life. And to be notified and informed that can actually be lifted and taken away, victims shouldn't fear that they're going to lose that protection because the terms of their probation may be lifted at some point.
So when you found out that there wouldn't be those protections for people once a sex offender or other defendants offer probation, how did you go about creating Kayleigh's law and getting it enacted in Arizona?
Well, I think I always want people to understand that I didn't know what I was doing. I just knew I was going to do it. And so for me, it wasn't an option to not pursue this, even though I didn't know how. So I just dove all in, and I looked up who my local legislator was, and I contacted her, and we very quickly got to work on a bill that would provide this protection for victims. I was shocked at how quickly it went through, and I've been told that I was spoiled that it went through so quickly with complete bipartisan support, that it was unheard of. And I didn't understand at the time. Now I understand, after being in this for 3 years, what an anomaly it really was to get that law passed like we did.
So there's some other states that have taken what Arizona adopted and looking at it as well?
Yeah. So Arizona was the first state in the nation to pass Kayleigh's law, which is the natural life injunction. In 2022, Governor Evers in the state of Wisconsin also signed Kayleigh's law into law there. And it's currently going through the legislative process in Missouri and Texas.
So are these states reaching out to you, or are you working with victims advocacy groups in other states? Or
it's all kinds of things,
Yeah.
whether it be a legislator that reaches out, an advocate, just an everyday citizen, a survivor. People reach out, and a lot of this is connecting the dots and finding the right person with the right drive to sponsor this bill. That's one of the biggest parts of it.
Are you finding in these states that there's victims such as you that feel like they've been let down, that there's not protection for their life?
Yeah.
Is what essentially how you got your draft of this bill?
Yes. Yeah, I think most victims assume that they will have protection forever. I know I did. I couldn't even imagine the thought of this man being able to ever contact me again. And so I think a lot of victims are very surprised when they learn that that could possibly go away, and they don't in fact have protection that is valid for their entire life.
I think, listening to your story today, I think most people that haven't been a victim of crime or not familiar with the criminal justice system would feel that that was something that was already in place. But as been a victim, you're seeing that there's needed changes, or
Absolutely.
but that's a very inspiring story. I think that other victims across the country are probably thinking, this is what I needed.
Yeah.
So you talked about victims not understanding the system. What advice would you give to victims and their families that are thrust without their consent into the system because of what's been done to them?
That's a tough question, because it's so traumatic and it's such an overwhelming time. It's hard to retain any information that's being given to you, and you don't realize things until later, once they start to set in or affect you. But I would encourage them to ask questions over and over, even if it's the same question they've asked 100 times. Don't be afraid to keep asking until you have a complete understanding, and you get an answer that you're able to understand, that you can internalize and sit with. Because if you're not fully understanding, then you don't know. But it's hard to ask those questions, especially in the midst of the trauma.
And you probably don't understand the system. David and I are so immersed that we know it and don't always understand that people don't know it as much as us.
Yeah.
Besides Kayleigh's law, are you pushing other type of changes to the system or other protections for victims?
I am, yes.
What are you working on?
So I'm currently spearheading 4 bills in Arizona that have to do with accountability, just closing loopholes in the system and narrowing the gap. Because here's the thing, we will never be bulletproof. That's impossible. But we can narrow the gap and be proactive instead of reactive. And that's ultimately the goal with the legislation that I'm behind.
When you say proactive instead of reactive, what specifically are you talking about or focusing on at the moment with your proposed legislation?
Well, accountability within the system. So narrowing the gaps so that we are erring on the side of caution versus having these very large gaps and these loopholes available that exist, and then we have to be reactive when things happen because these exist. If we're proactive and we can narrow those gaps and close the loopholes, then we're going to eliminate, we have the potential to eliminate some future problems in regard to victims and sex offenders.
Are you doing all this on your own? Have you started a nonprofit foundation to help support and do things or help you do what you're trying to accomplish?
I do most of it on my own. I have met some very incredible people. I shouldn't say I do it on my own. I drive the driving force behind it. But I have met some incredible people who show up to help. I don't believe God makes mistakes, and He continually places just amazing individuals along the journey of this to help. And whether it's citizens or people like you who just want to get involved and do what they can. And every piece of the puzzle is so important. So different roles that are played are very instrumental for this process.
It's got to be a financial hardship on you too, because I know that you've talked about other states looking at Kayleigh's law, and you've traveled to testify to those states and been there for, like in Wisconsin, for the governor's signing of the bill, but yet that all's coming out of your pocket.
It is, yes. Yes.
Which actually shows, one, the passion that you and the support you have from your family for this. Do you foresee that continuing?
Yeah, I hope one day I can find a way to make money doing what I'm doing. I believe it will come in time, but I do have a nonprofit, a 501c4, and it's Because You Still Matter. And I'm fighting for victims and survivors because you still matter.
And that's what it's called?
Yes.
So, and is there a .com or
yes.
.org?
Yes, so my website is becauseyoustillmatter.com, because I also have an LLC that I do other things under.
And I assume you accept donations? So
donations are
watching,
always incredible. I'm so grateful for donations, because it's a lot of, I'm not that I wouldn't do it without hesitation, but it's a lot of time and it does cost a lot of money. But the mission and the purpose is important to me. And so I always find a way, and God always finds a way to bless me as well. So, but donations are always appreciated.
So what is your next goal? Is it to get Kayleigh's law to all 50 states, or is it something else? What is your big goal at the moment?
The biggest goal would be to get Kayleigh's law passed across the nation, because it's incredible that it's passed in 2 states, but 2 states is not enough, because victims and survivors across the nation matter, and they deserve this protection. So that's the biggest goal. And along the way, just drafting policy that will continue to narrow the gaps and enhance the system.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate your advocacy for victims. You know, as law enforcement, our investigations is always our initial contact with the victim. And although our heart goes out to them, it seems our focus then turns to the perpetrator and the defendant.
Yeah.
And we're working, and we've always make it a point to make sure we have that contact with the victim, because like you've said in your process, you feel like you just get lost in the shuffle.
Yeah.
And because of people like you, you're giving a voice to everyone across this country. So thank you for what you're doing.
And I think it also emphasizes why it's so important to have strong victim services to be there to help answer the questions, because sometimes the law enforcement officers or the prosecutors are focused on trying to get a conviction, and we kind of lose focus on our victims at times.
Yeah.
But we have those people there to help and to say, they got a question, you got to stop for a moment and answer it.
Yeah. That's why I said every piece of the puzzle is very important. It's needed in this area for sure.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for taking the time to share your story and to share your advocacy with us and with our audience.
Oh, thank you.
And thank you for joining us this month for Shooting Straight with Brad and David. And please stay tuned for this month's Most Wanted.
Defane Hope Walker has a valid and confirmed felony warrant for failure to appear on original charges of aggravated DUI and aggravated extreme DUI. Defane's last known address was Show Low, Arizona. If you have any information on the whereabouts of Defane, please call Navajo County Communications Center at 928-524-4050. Or to remain anonymous, please call We Tip at 1-800-78-CRIME.